Hello again. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about something very important when it comes to choosing fruit tree varieties, and that is pollination groups, because if you're going to get fruit you need pollination, and pollination groups are the periods of time in which different varieties of fruit flower. So I'm going to use the example of the apple trees that we have on site to give you a sense of how that works in practice and how it doesn't always match up with what the tables tell you. So there's usually, for apples, 5 pollination groups, and they might be numbered 1 to 5 or A to E. The RHS, which is the Royal Horticultural Society in Britain, has about 7 or 8, but there's not many varieties in those sort of 6, 7s and 8s. But there are some varieties that flower really late, and of course if you're wanting them to provide fruit you need other very late flowering varieties to pollinize them. So here we have what we understood to be a leathercoat russet, and you can go online and do a search and say what is the pollination group for leathercoat russet, and I can't honestly remember what it was but it became irrelevant when we realized a few years in, when it finally flowered this tree, finally fruited, that this was not a leathercoat russet. And so that whole point of choosing a variety with a particular pollination group kind of went out the window at that point. And interestingly also, this beautiful tree behind us, and these two, as it happens, are pollinizing each other, because you can see they're both in full bloom, and this is the beginning of May. There is one other tree in this picture which you can probably only just see if I point it out, and you'll see that this is also, it's a very young tree, it's early days, and it is flowering, so there's some overlap there. So certainly these three will be fine together, and this one at the back is called Ashmead's Kernel. And if you go online it'll say that it's a D or a 4 on the RHS website. So I use the RHS list simply because it's a consistent list, and if you look at different sources they'll say different things. So some sources will say that's an E or a 5, and some will say it's a C or a 3. The RHS says it's a 4, and so just in order to compare different varieties together, stick to one list, and I choose the RHS for Britain. Obviously if you're in other countries you'll have other varieties and you'll need your own list, but choose from one list. Don't pick different pollination group data for different varieties from different lists. That's just going to be confusing. So this immediately became interesting when we realized this was not what we thought it was, and we have no idea what it is. We could spend £35 apparently now for a DNA test, send off a leaf and they'll tell us what it is. But there's we enjoy the mystery of it. It's a red apple with a pink tinge in the flesh. It's very beautiful, it's very nice, very tasty, quite productive. We're very happy with it, but it's not what we thought it was going to be. And there's not really much you can do about that. This one over here is meant to be Beauty of Bath. That's what we bought, Beauty of Bath, which is supposed to be a 2. Now, we know this is flowering now. Ashmead's Kernel is a 4. That's not a Beauty of Bath. And we also know from the apple, which is different from this one, I'm happy to say, and that it doesn't fruit as early as Beauty of Bath would do. This is not a Beauty of Bath, but we're also happy with the apple, but it's not. So don't necessarily expect what you buy to be what you get. That's another thing to consider. So what we have to do here is compare one against another. So the other thing to be noting here is that we've got 3 trees up here. We've got one down on the main lower lawn, and we've got 2 espaliers also in the main courtyard, and these are all in different locations. So you might end up choosing varieties with different pollination groups, but by putting them in different places they might end up still flowering around the same time, and that seems to be pretty much what's happening here. So Just want to also point out while we're in the top orchard, so this is the most exposed part of the site, but also the sunniest, so they get the most sunshine up here, but also the most wind exposure. And we've grafted some varieties onto the hedge, and let's have a look at that now. So this is our windbreak, and within the windbreak are quite a lot of apple trees. Now these are not varieties, these, well, they were planted by the previous people that were here, and so we don't entirely know what they did. We assumed at first that they'd just chosen crab apples to make hedging, but I think because of the variety we're seeing is that these are actually trees that have been grown from seed. Maybe they ate some apples like the apple, thought we'll plant the seed, get more of the apple. And of course with apples you don't get that, because you get a cross. The fruit becomes a cross between the variety that you're eating, but also the pollen provided by the variety that's pollinizing. And very often in commercial environments they tend to be crabs. They're often small bitter apples, so you don't end up with something very nice. But these are some of the apples. These produce quite nice. There's actually another video I've made that talks, where I demonstrate the difference between the apples that this naturally produces and the graft. So this is a graft from my partner's sister moved house, and she had a lovely apple tree where she was before, and she decided that she would like to take some with her, and so we took cuttings and we grafted that variety onto the hedge here in several different places. And this is the one that fruited last year that's in the other video. It's a big, more or less cooking apple, but you can also eat it raw as well. And you can see that this one is already flowered. So the pollination group for this variety, whatever it is, we're calling it Kipling's, but we don't know what it is. It's obviously a named variety of some sort, and this has already flowered. So this is going to be an early flowering group. This is probably a C, because it was flowering pretty recently, and there was a bit of an overlap between this being in flower and the other trees in the orchard here as well. So we're guessing this is a C, and again this could help us to identify this variety at some point in the future by knowing pretty much what its flowering group is. So this is another variety I would definitely recommend, and this is called Topaz. This is also a group 4, so the same as Ashmead's kernel. And the difference here, because this has gone pretty much over, when this was in flower it was amazing, and as you can see there are still some flowers doing their thing, but mostly they've gone over and they're starting to make fruit. And the difference here is that this is in a much more sheltered position compared to the top orchard. It's not that far away, but that's a bit more exposed up there. Down here we've got the sort of fencing, and whilst it might get a little bit less light, it's certainly getting a lot more shelter from the wind, and so the temperature here might be that little bit warmer and may have encouraged this slightly early flowering, which means that you can have different varieties and different pollination groups, and you can, by putting them in slightly different microclimates, you can adjust that flowering time so that increases the chances of you getting fruit. So down here in the courtyard we've got 2 more varieties, these both being grown as espaliers. The training is going okay, but it's not as easy as it looks in the books. So there's 2 varieties. This one is Kids Orange Red, and this one is Egremont Russet. And in terms of pollination groups, this is a 3 and this is a 2. So this should have been flowering 3 weeks perhaps before the trees that I've just shown you at the top. But as you can see, it's now in flower. So this is where it gets really interesting, because one of the things to note here is that there's a lot less light, so it's more sheltered down here, and it's getting the evening sun as the sun sets in the sort of heading into the northwest over there. But what it's not getting is light during much of the day, and the hedge behind it is also an apple hedge, so that's very vigorous. And for the last few years, these have struggled for light. So again, this was an experiment. Can we grow espaliers here? So it's in a lot of shade for much of the day, and so presumably that's affecting the timing. It's delaying the timing of flowering, the fact that it's not getting as much sun as the other varieties that we've seen up on the top. So this is the last tree I want to show you. This is a Newton Wonder, and this is a cooking apple which also could be eaten raw as a sort of dessert apple to some degree, and it's on a larger rootstock. It's quite a big tree, and this is it's been planted with lots of space around it, so it's getting plenty of light, but it's also getting a lot of shelter because it's low down behind the woods and behind the house, and the prevailing winds don't really get down here so much. And the pollination group here is a 5, so we've looked at in the front courtyard in the shade over there, we've got a variety that's a pollination group 2 is in flower, and over here we've got a group 5 in flower at the same time. So local conditions can change the timing of flowering, and you can work with that to some degree. In terms of approaching pollination groups and varieties, I would always say choose something you like in the way of a variety. So if you ask my partner, she would say, well, she did say, some kind of russet. So we bought the Egremont russet, and then we looked for another variety we would like which had either the same pollination group or an overlapping one. So we went with the Kids Orange Red because that's a 3, Egremont russet is a 2. In practice, we can see that they flower pretty much at the same time, and they are pollinating each other because we're getting some fruit. But you can also, as I say, look at microclimates. If you're in a tricky site, then it's a good idea to go with later flowering varieties, because if you're exposed to the wind or you get late frosts in the spring, then early flowering varieties, those conditions could either blow away the insects, so the insects don't actually get to do any pollinating, or damage the blossoms. So in more challenging environments, choose later flowering varieties, but you might just go with which varieties you like and choosing something on that basis.